Hello, everyone. Why would you show poor judgment in showing up at a public event on day 11 of laryngitis, which I've never had before in my life? Why would you show poor judgment? Risk your own life and your voice, which to me, to anyone who's ever met me, they know that is my life, just to come to a talk. And what I think you will find today is that anyone who's ever read the work of Marion Nestle, which is many people, anyone who's ever listened to one of the 2,700 video interviews that she's given, including one I just listened to last week, even better, because we're all lucky to be at NYU, anyone who's ever met Marion shows up. And shows up for the simple reason that she's never failed. We're not friends. She hasn't paid me to say this. But she's never failed to make people think. She's never failed to deliver the science, the art, the society around global public health, food, what we eat, and this crazy thing we all tell ourselves that keep most of us up at night, which is how we're supposed to lead our lives, you know, where many people start for better and for worse with food, right? Once you've started down the Marion Nestle road, you don't stop. I want to read a formal biography for her to give you a little more background, and then close with a few more words. Marion Nestle is the Paulette Goddard Professor Emerita of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at New York University. I emphasize the Emerita because you wouldn't know it from her glad continued presence on campus and the incredible rate at which she's continuing to publish and to join all of us in conversation. She was fundamental in founding now the world-famous Department of Food Studies at Steinhardt. She chaired that department from 1988 to 2003 in one form or another. She earned, and this is now where we get into liberal studies territory, right? She earned a PhD in molecular biology and a master's in public health nutrition from UC Berkeley. Her distinguished career includes serving as a senior nutrition policy advisor at the Department of Health and Human Services, I hope we still have that, and editing the 1988 Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health. Dr. Nestle's research explores how food industry marketing and business interests influence scientific research and health consequences. She has authored 16 books. That's the other reason for everyone to stay up at night not sleeping. Why haven't you written 16 books? Why haven't I written 16 books? That's the bad part about inviting Marion Nestle to come speak, including the award-winning Food Politics and her memoir, Slow Cooked. Recognized as a public health hero, deservedly, I would say. Her honors include the James Beard Leadership Award and the 2023 Edinburgh Medal. She maintains, as you've heard me say, a significant public presence, which includes her daily blog, Food Politics, which I encourage everyone to take a look at, and most recently has received the Johns Hopkins Dean's Medal in 2025. It should go without saying, whether she wants to be knighted as an honorary member of our community or not, Marion Nestle, from start to finish, is liberal studies, right? She's the best of everything we want the students in this room to be doing, and it's why when people planning this, because when I started here last summer, I was like, oh my God, Marion Nestle's coming. That's about as far as I went, right? And then I connected it to the Student Research Colloquium, and I didn't even have to ask. Why? Because we could have invited Marion to give the global lecture. We could have invited her to do this. We could have invited her to do that. There's lots of reasons to invite Marion Nestle to anything. But it's particularly, we wanted her here because, to me at least, and I hope you will agree, not least when we have a chance to hear, now I've copied it all up, Food Politics 2025 from Research to Policy Advocacy is that, to me at least, she embodies the best of what we want everyone in this room to be taking from liberal studies, whether you're a student here, whether we're all lucky to be faculty, whether we're working here as staff. There's an incredible collective momentum to wanting the person who's making important decisions about social issues to know the science, to know the art, to know the social background, to know the historical relevance, to be flawless at the economics of it, and on, right? It's not interdisciplinarity as a fetish, it's interdisciplinarity when it matters more than anything else. And Marianne's the man, and the woman, and the boss. Please join me in welcoming Marianne Nassel.
Thank you so much for that embarrassing introduction. It is such an honor to be here. I mean, really, when I was asked to do this, I thought, wow, this is really an impressive invitation. And now that I've seen the research that you've all been doing, I'm even more impressed. I, too, am a public health menace. I have whatever it is he's got, I've got it, a version of it too. And mine expresses itself by coughing fits. And if I turn out to have a coughing fit in the middle of this, I'm going to go out there and cough it out, and then I'll come back, I promise. With a little luck, I won't have one. As you find, so let me start. I was asked, first of all, to talk about my own career, and then I want to talk about the kind of thing that I'm doing now. I write books about food politics. I've written a lot of books about food politics, and most of them have been done within the last 25 years. The 4 most recent are a memoir, and I love showing the cover because I haven't changed a bit. The most recent is What to Eat Now, which is my magnum opus. It's 700 pages. It's so embarrassing. And then I have a new one coming out in the fall called Sugar Coated, which is a book about using cereal boxes to illustrate food policy in the United States. And my co-author is a former vice president of Kellogg who left without signing a non-disclosure agreement. Oh, we had such a good time writing it. We really did. Well, as you've heard, I've been at NYU for a really long time. I was recruited here in 1988. I retired in 2017. This is what retirement looks like. And my entire career has been about science communication, which is kind of why I'm here today. I spend a lot of my time interpreting nutrition information and either lecturing or talking to reporters or writing about nutrition issues, not only for professionals, but for the general public. It never occurred to me when I started doing this that I would be considered as a powerful foodie taking on soda giants, or that I would be considered one of the country's most hysterical anti-food industry fanatics. I'm not sure either one of those is true, but whatever. I started out, as you've heard, I thought I would just give my scientific credentials. Most of my work was done at the University of California, Berkeley. I have a bachelor's degree in bacteriology, a doctorate in molecular biology. I did a postdoc in biology and biochemistry departments at Brandeis University, and I came back much later and did a master's in public health nutrition, also at UC Berkeley. I stopped being a bench scientist during the time that I went to graduate school. I had 2 small children. That's me with my 2 small children, who are now quite grown. And so I had a kind of difficult career. I started out as a bench scientist, but just really, really, really couldn't do it. During the period I was a bench scientist, I was at Brandeis University, and I taught courses in introductory biology. I ran the introductory biology, zoology, and plant biology lab, and I taught courses in cell and molecular biology. in what turned out to be, and that's the only picture I have ever of me in my laboratory doing microscopic work and running that lab. In my last year at Brandeis, the department that I was in had a rule that professors could only teach the same class 3 times in a row. And then at the end of the third one, you had to teach something else. This was to keep faculty from getting stale. And you had to teach whatever the department needed. And my 3 semesters of teaching cell and molecular biology were up, and students were sitting in the department chair's office demanding human biology classes. They found cell and molecular biology tedious and wanted something that felt a little bit more relevant. And I was offered a choice of human physiology or human nutrition. And I knew that teaching kidney acid-base balance was not something that I ever wanted to teach. And I love to eat, so I picked nutrition. And it turned out to be an extraordinarily good thing to have done. I fell in love with nutrition, not only in the first course I ever taught, but on the very, very first day. Because I loved the way nutrition dealt with what you could eat. It was delicious, but it also involved history, it involved science, it involved politics, it involved health, it involved everything that you could think of, and it was going to be really, really fun to teach. And I discovered this on the very, very first day that I sat down to prepare a course on something I knew absolutely nothing about. And the first thing that I did was to collect every nutrition textbook I could find and open those textbooks up to the page that listed the nutrients that were required for human health, the ones that you have to get from food because your body can't make them. And to my enormous surprise, the list in every book was different. Many of them listed, the standard vitamins and minerals that you see on food labels, but some listed nutrients that were only required for animals. Some listed nutrients that were conditionally required. You made your own, but you needed much more of other kinds of substances. And I thought that was kind of curious. So I went to the library and I got a book called Recommended Dietary Allowances, which in those days was a publication that was under 100 pages. It's now 6 volumes and thousands of pages, but it was pretty short then. And this was the book that described the basis of human nutritional requirements. And I opened the book at random to the vitamin thiamine. I just started reading about the studies that linked, that proved that thiamine was deficient, or that thiamine was essential in human diets, and that looked at what happened if you induced a deficiency of thiamine. And the first study that I landed on, and Brandeis had a great library. It had stacks in those days, and you could just walk to the stacks and pull the journals off the shelves. And I picked up a study that was done in 1940, and it was one of the studies on which the essentiality of thiamine was based, and it was done on 6 young women in a mental institution. I thought, well, that's kind of funny. One of the symptoms of thiamine deficiency is mental problems. Why are they making people who are already in a mental institution mentally ill by feeding them a thiamine deficient diet? The other thing was that one of the assays for thiamine deficiency was the complacency of their behavior in having to do chores around the hospital. I thought, what? That's an assay for nutrient deficiency? This is amazing. This kind of study is the basis of what's on food labels for thiamine? And then I thought, well, let me look at another one. And I picked up vitamin C. And I went to the library, picked up a study on vitamin C. And this one was done on 6 prisoners in a penitentiary in the Midwest. And during the study, 2 of the prisoners escaped. I thought, this is not a well-controlled clinical trial. And this was the first day. I was totally hooked. It was clear to me that nutrition was something that you could teach to undergraduate students, and you could teach them critical thinking. They could not do critical thinking in cell and molecular biology because the studies were too complicated and abstract, and there was a whole language issue. But any undergraduate student could start reading original scientific research in nutrition and do critical thinking at it. Too few subjects, too ridiculous an assay, too poorly controlled, and we were off and running. And in my first class, which was 1975, I used the daily food guide from the Department of Agriculture, but I also used Francis Moore Lappé's Diet for a Small Planet, still in press. Center for Science in the Public Interest had just been founded, and they had published a book called Food for People, Not for Profit that could have been written yesterday, that discussed an enormous range of issues about food consumption and food production. And I used articles from the New York Review of Books on wealth and power, the politics of food and oil, that showed that the politics of food and oil were very similar, because they both derived from corporate need for profit. And we were off and running. I only taught those courses twice, and then I was married at the time. My husband got a job at the University of California, San Francisco, and I was hired there to teach nutrition to medical students. And I did that under what was called the rubric of Nutrition UCSF. Amongst other things, I did a television program on public television in San Francisco called Over Easy, and there I am explaining the structure of sugar to the host. I started writing articles about nutrition in medical education, one after another, and I wrote my first article on nutrition policy at that time. I also wrote my first book, Nutrition in Clinical Practice. It came out in 1985, and when I was writing my memoir, I went on Amazon to find out if any copies of it were available, and I found this copy for $930. You gotta be kidding me. This is a book that's 40 years out of print. And what's really shocking is it's not there anymore. Does that mean somebody bought it? Okay. I went on from there to Washington, D.C., where I worked for the government for 2 years. A very, very interesting experience. This was during the Reagan administration. And my job was to edit the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health, which came out in 1988. And it was an amazing experience because I wrote speeches for the Surgeon General, who was then C. Everett Koop, a quite amazing man who was a fundamentalist Christian. Everybody was very upset when he was hired, but he turned out to be a public health hero for his work on, particularly on AIDS. He considered people who had AIDS to be human, which not everybody did in those days. Anyway, on the basis of that experience, I was recruited at NYU to chair what was then the Department of Home Economics and Nutrition. And it turned out to be a really great move for me because universities require faculty to teach, do research, and do public service. And I happen to like doing all of those things a lot. And the big challenge was to figure out how to do research when I was no longer doing bench research. And we didn't have laboratories. I was in a department of home economics in the what is now the Steinhardt School. And it was very hard to figure out what was going to count for research under those circumstances. I got my start in the food politics, food policy area, and I can attribute that to a specific event. In the early 1990s, I went to a meeting at the National Cancer Institute. That was on behavioral causes of cancer. The two behaviors that were being looked at were cigarette smoking and diet. I was there to represent diet. But most of the speakers were national and international physicians and scientists who were doing enormous anti-smoking advocacy. And I tell you, I knew that cigarettes caused cancer. I went to that meeting knowing that. And I knew that cigarette companies advertised to kids. But this meeting was about cigarette marketing and how cigarette companies marketed to adults and children. And the most powerful talk that I heard was somebody from the University of California, San Diego, who had written this paper and gave a talk on cigarette marketing to children, particularly to teenage boys, through Joe Camel. And even though I knew this was happening, I had never paid any attention to it before. Cigarette marketing was so much a part of the natural landscape. Everywhere you went, there was Joe Camel. You never even noticed it. And I walked out of that meeting thinking, we should be doing the same thing for Coca-Cola. And that was it. For me, that was an enormous turning point. I started paying attention. I started writing articles about soft drink pouring rights, the contracts that soft drink companies had with schools like NYU, but all the way down to grammar schools in those days for exclusive sales of either Coke or Pepsi on the campus. I started writing about the diet industry's role in obesity research. I started writing about techno foods, foods that were being marketed as having functional properties over and above their nutritional content. I started writing about the food pyramid and the politics of the food pyramid that had come out in 1992. And started writing it from the standpoint of political history. And at some point, I figured out that NYU likes books, that you get rewarded at NYU if you write books. And that was the genesis of food politics. I put all those articles together. And that was my first book, Food Politics, or the first book on these topics that came out in 2002. And it's come out in 2 subsequent editions. If you don't have it, don't buy it. Wait a year, because there's going to be a 25th anniversary edition in 2027. So after all that, I'm at NYU for 20 years or so. I'm doing research teaching, and I'm doing quite a bit of public service. And by public service, I mean lectures like this one, the media interviews that I give with reporters who I talk to almost every day, my blog, foodpolitics.com, which I do 5 times a week, and then Twitter, and I think I'm on Instagram and a few other things. I don't pay much attention to social media, but it's there. And I began to write increasingly controversial interpretations of what I was, of food politics. All of them science-based, everything heavily referenced. I write book chapters on the commercial determinants of health. I wrote a book on how food companies influence the nutrition research, an entire book on how food companies influence the research that they pay for. I write books I write articles on how we should regulate the food industry, on how to prevent obesity. And I'm still writing little articles. I don't know, I've had a bunch this year already on the politics of the new dietary guidelines, or the particularly controversial article on whether the food justice movement and the Make America Healthy Again movement have anything in common. I think yes. Other people think no. It's an interesting discussion. And I'm still writing the blog. The purpose, I've written this blog at foodpolitics.com ridiculously since 2007. I can't believe it's been going on so long. But it has a real benefit for me. It forces me to keep up. It gives me an opportunity to answer questions that I get asked all the time. It forces me to organize my thinking in a coherent way, and I get to promote my own ideas about things that are happening and to advocate for positions that I'm interested in. And I'm no longer taking any feedback on it because there was too much trolling. So I just get to say what I want, and I never know what happens to it unless people tell me. I'm still talking to reporters practically every day. This one is from this last week. I talked to a reporter at the Times about raw milk, which is a big issue right now because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. really likes raw milk. And it's a health and safety risk. You want to drink more raw milk, it's fine with me. Just be willing to take the consequences. And I talked to Scientific American this week about the arguments between the American Heart Association and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about whether diets ought to have a lot of meat in them or not. RFK Jr. says yes, the Heart Association says no. And I've been able to do that, I think, because of my extraordinary position at NYU. I've been a happy camper at NYU. I was hired here as a full professor with tenure. It was the best thing that ever happened to me because it gave me a platform on which to say what I wanted to say without and never at any time has anyone at NYU ever come up to me and said, we wish you would be a little quieter about the food industry because if you would shut up, we might be able to get money from them. Nobody ever said that to me. Whether they thought it or not is another matter, but they certainly never said anything. And I've had an enormously privileged position here because of that, for which I am deeply grateful. And I should say off the bat that one of the reasons why it was privileged was I didn't have to worry about money. I had a salary from NYU and an apartment that, I don't pay a very high rent for. And my NYU salary and now my retirement benefits pay for everything. I have enough money to do what I want to do. It pays for the blog. And I also earn royalties from the books. I wish they were bigger. And honoraria from lectures for nonprofit groups. I don't have to take any money from food, beverage, or supplement companies. Very, very privileged. So that's that story. I thought what I would do for the remaining time would be to talk a little bit about what for me is the hot current issue that links science and politics very strongly. When I wrote Food Politics in 2002, the first question that everybody asked me, was what does food have to do with politics? You know what? I don't get asked that anymore. And part of the reason I don't get asked that anymore is a year ago we had President Donald Trump announcing his appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services with this astonishing statement. For too long, Americans have been crushed by the industrial food complex and drug companies who've engaged in deception, misinformation, and disinformation when it comes to public health. Donald Trump? And here's RFK Jr. saying, let's make America healthy again, calling out the food industry as the primary culprit in the worsening health epidemic, saying that corporate capture is the biggest threat to American democracy and that ultra-processed food is poisoning Americans. They sounded just like me. How is this possible? So let's look at what they're doing with this. And I thought I would talk about the politics of the dietary guidelines because the dietary guidelines were announced in January. and they have proven to be quite controversial. And if you've never heard of the dietary guidelines, you're not alone, but they are the official statement of government nutrition policy. They govern what is in food assistance programs like SNAP and the Women, Infant, and Children's Program, school meals, and meals served to the military. They are supposed to determine what nutrition professionals tell their clients and the people that they're advising. They have an enormous impact on the food industry because if the guidelines say not to eat something, the food industry might lose sales. Whether they affect the general public is something we can argue about. Most people have never heard of them. They have a long history. Dietary guidelines have been published since 1980, and since 1990, Congress has said they have to be published every 5 years. The arrow points to the 1995 dietary guidelines. I served on the advisory committee that year, and I can tell you, at that time, our committee chose what to do research on, did the research, wrote the research report, and wrote the actual dietary guidelines. That happened only once more after that, and then under Bush II, the process changed and the agencies took over writing the guidelines, and over the subsequent years, Health and Human Services and Agriculture have taken over more and more of the preparation of the dietary guidelines. So what used to be a scientific advisory report is now a federal political report. And that has continued up until the present. So the process remained the same up until December 2024, when the Scientific Advisory Committee, the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee, produced its very, very long scientific report. And the advice that it gave was the same advice that had been given since 1980. That advice has never changed. Why we need a new one every 5 years is arguable. And those are that you should be eating highly nutritious foods, mostly plants, eat less red and processed meat. If you're eating dairy foods, they should be fat-free, balance calories, and limit sugar, sodium, salt, saturated fat, and alcohol. That advice has been around for decades. This committee, for the first time, was asked to talk about ultra-processed foods, which are those foods that are basically industrially produced junk foods. And they decided that the evidence on those was not good enough to make any recommendation, so they did not make a recommendation about ultra-processed foods. But basically, the dietary guidelines, through all of this, can be summarized by the journalist Michael Pollan in 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. My book, What to Eat Now, does the same thing in 700 pages. So the first Make America Healthy Again report that came out in May of 2025 argued that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report was compromised because it didn't address ultra-processed foods. It was unduly influenced by corporations. 95% of the members of that committee had financial ties to food, beverage, or supplement companies, and it was too long and complicated. Wow, I thought. Just what I think. How amazing. And I was very curious to see where they would go with this. And the first inkling of that came in August 2025, when Kennedy said, "Our new version will be short, simple, and focused on health, not corporate interests," which sounded really impressive to me. The only thing that made me worried about it was that earlier, the departments had issued a joint statement done by Brooke Rollins, who was the Secretary of Agriculture. And this was a kind of alarming statement. We're going to make certain that these guidelines are based on sound science, not political science. Gone are the days when leftist ideologies guide public policy. What? What leftist ideologies? When did leftist ideologies ever have anything to do with the dietary guidelines? And then I thought, aha, plants. Plants. Leftist ideology and dietary guidelines? I think they mean plants versus animal foods. I think they mean expertise versus personal experience. I think they mean government regulation rather than personal responsibility for diets. I think they mean equity versus real science. Okay, let's see how all this plays out. So here is Robert F. Kennedy saying, we need to stop trusting the experts. Trusting the experts is not a feature of science or democracy. It's a feature of religion and totalitarianism. Oh. Or how about equity? Let's prioritize, and this comes from a fact sheet that was handed out on the day the dietary guidelines were released. Prioritizing health outcomes, not health equity. What do they mean by that? Well, when DEI impacts nutrition science, see if you can get your head around this statement. It enables special interests to argue that the status quo is acceptable because if you believe in DEI principles, it's going to violate those principles to encourage Americans to eat healthier food? What? Okay, let's see how this plays out. So, January 7th, 2026, a very difficult day in my life, I have to say. The phone started ringing at 7 o'clock in the morning and didn't stop until midnight. The agencies released sort of piecemeal a bunch of documents. And I won't do them in order. I've reorganized this so it makes sense. The process for doing these dietary guidelines revealed on January 7th, because they had been secret up until then, was to produce a 400-page summary of research or compendium of research articles written by 9 individuals, each one writing his or her own summary of a particular area of research. These had one author, sometimes with help. They were reviews of the scientific literature. Those were used by one author to sort of as the basis for writing a 90-page research summary. That was used by, we have no idea who, to produce a 10-page dietary guidelines document. And then that was used, and again, we have no idea who did it, for a website. And it turned out that the website was where you found out about all this stuff. And if you didn't look at the website, you would never have known about it. So the overall message of the website, Eat Real Food, which is supposed to be the overall message of the dietary guidelines, this is the only place where the Eat Real Food appears, is on the website. And it's the only place where there are links to all of these documents. So that took some doing. The rationale for all of this was given on Twitter, X, by Callie Means, who is the chief food and nutrition policy advisor to RFK Jr., and he explained that humans don't overeat carrots, broccoli, salmon, and steak. Our body has natural satiety signals for real food. So if you eat real food and don't eat a lot of processed food, you will have automatic satiation and you never have to worry about any bad things about diet. So here are the actual dietary guidelines. There are 8 of them, and I've stated them exactly the way they're stated. And what I've done here is shown the ones that have repeated the same old advice. Those are in red, and the new stuff is in green. So the old advice, balance calories, get your food, get your calories from dairy, vegetables, and fruits, whole grains, limit added sugars, refined carbohydrates, and alcohol. All that's old stuff. That's been said forever. What was new in these was prioritizing protein foods at every meal, a big shock because Americans eat twice the amount of protein needed already, and protein has never been a dietary issue. Consume full fat, not low fat dairy. Incorporate healthy fats defined as butter and beef tallow, highly saturated, kind of weird. And then the limit highly processed foods, which I thought was a good step forward. I like that one. But the others are just weird. And the weirdness shows up on Twitter, which is where food policy is given these days. So here is Robert F. Kennedy saying, we're going to publish dietary guidelines stressing the importance of protein and saturated fat. Why? Why protein? Saturated fat? When there's so much evidence that unsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are healthier. Here is the actual guideline. Consume a variety of protein foods, first from animal sources, as well as from plant-sourced foods. Okay, that was a reversal from previous guidelines, which emphasized plants more. So now we're emphasizing meat. And this was shown up in the introduction of the new upside-down food pyramid, which came in discrete screens as you scrolled through. And I took screenshots of them, and I'm really glad I did because this website has been taken down now, and you can't find this anymore. But I've got it. So the first one was protein, dairy, and healthy fats, and then they got bigger in the next one. And then you got the other sources of fats in American diets. And finally, you got to the vegetables and fruits. And even more finally, you got to the whole grains. So this looked like pushing meat to me, which made no sense. And I wasn't the only one who thought so. The new food pyramid brought to you by Big Meat. And I thought this was an example of meat industry lobbying. But when I wrote about that on my blog, I was told, no, this is not meat industry lobbying. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s personal ideology. He only eats meats and fermented foods. He eats the carnivore diet. And here he was on Instagram. I hope you're impressed by how much social media I use. The no cake, just steak, happy birthday. There he is with candles on a steak. And here's the President of the United States and the Secretaries of Health and Human Services and Agriculture with milk mustaches and promoting drinking of whole milk. Here, investigative reporters have said that this is an example of very effectively of dairy industry lobbying and the power of the dairy industry and the meat industry. Every state has cattle and dairy cattle, and every state has 2 senators. So these are very powerful industries. But just like protein is a euphemism for red meat, everybody understands if you're talking about protein, you're supposed to be talking about red meat. I think whole milk is a euphemism for raw milk. They couldn't say drink raw milk in the dietary guidelines because there's so much evidence about harm, and there's an enormous case going on right now with something called raw farm where babies are being sickened. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did raw milk shooters at the White House, and the Make America Healthy Again moms organizations are pushing hard for legalization of raw milk, make milk raw again. But in general, Kennedy, and here he is in his Mike Tyson mode, saying beef is back, whole milk, butter, bacon, and eggs are back. The war on real nutrient-dense food is over. Are you ready to enjoy eating again? So my interpretation of this is a variation on the Michael Pollan advice. It's now eat real food as much as you like, mostly meat. a new era in American food politics. Kennedy promised that the people who wrote the new dietary guidelines would not have conflicts of interest with food, beverage, or supplement companies. And the Scientific Foundation report, the 90-page report, not only published the names of the people who had written those reports, but also published their conflicts of interest. And I've just listed here the meat and dairy groups that the members of the committee had reported affiliations with. A very impressive list of meat and dairy financial contacts between people who wrote the research and these organizations. So if he was trying to get rid of conflicts of interest, he didn't do a very good job of it. And then behind the new dietary guidelines, according to reporters, were industry-funded studies, yes, opaque science, yes, and crushing deadline pressure. This was all thrown together in an enormous hurry between August and December 2025. So here is what's happening right now. Last week, the American Heart Association came out with its own set of dietary guidelines. And it says less meat, more plants, just like dietary guidelines always have, in contrast with the new Make America Healthy Again ones. And here's the guidance for cardiovascular health. And you know, there's really only one diet. One diet is for every disease you can think of, but the Heart Association has been very active in specifying cardiovascular health, but this works for everything. And it's the same thing: balance calories, eat plenty of vegetables, fruits, healthy proteins, which means plants as well as animals and fish, whole grains, unsaturated fats. They're not promoting butter and beef tallow, and minimize sugars, sodium, alcohol, and for the first time, ultra-processed foods. Seems perfectly reasonable. So there's been a lot of publicity about the contrast between the two sets of guidelines. But here is Callie Means, who, for the first time that I've seen, has made an extraordinarily gracious statement about the differences. And he said, the American Heart Association gave the administration an opportunity to review the guidelines, and they are aligned on the major, capital letters, issues: eat real food, limit processed foods, limit refined grains, and limit added sugars. He says nothing in this about saturated fat, butter, beef tallow, or the ridiculous advice about protein. And then he says these issues are too important to not work together on, and we're grateful to the American Heart Association for constructive dialogue. It's the first time I've ever seen him say anything at this level of graciousness. Well, how important is all of this? I thought this cartoon took care of the general sense of that. There's very little evidence that people follow dietary guidelines or pay any attention to them, whether the pyramid is one shape or another. The whatever pyramid is what guides American eating habits. But I do want to make one other point about all these, and that is that the new dietary guidelines are intensely focused on personal responsibility. It's up to you to make food choices that promote your own health, regardless of how easy or difficult or expensive that may be to do. So here's RFK Jr. again saying, we're not going to regulate. We are not getting rid of processed foods. This is America. It's not a nanny state. But we're going to tell you what's in your food and what's healthy and what's not. In other words, we're going to educate. If only education was enough to help people change their dietary behavior. Unfortunately, it's not least because lots of people can't afford to eat that way. So I'm concerned that the current administration is not nearly interested enough in creating a food environment that will help people eat more healthfully, and is not considering changes in tax policy, subsidy policy, not increasing SNAP benefits, not including marketing restrictions, not even thinking about universal school meals or universal basic income or campaign reform that might actually create a food environment that promotes health. And I also want to make a point about the context in which these dietary guidelines are being discussed. While the Make America Healthy Again movement is focusing on things like food dyes and substituting cane sugar for high fructose corn syrup and getting rid of seed oils and mercury in vaccinations, it's not saying anything about climate change, which meat has a lot to do with. It's not saying anything about sustainability, and equity is absolutely off the table at the same time that the departments are destroying the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC, and basically completely undermining the public health apparatus. So what do we do about all this? I think we try to vote with our fork whenever we make choices at the grocery store. But even better, we need to vote with our votes and advocate and take political action to get the kind of food system that really would make people healthier. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for letting me share this with you. And I'm so grateful to have gotten through this without coughing. You have no idea how relieved I am. Do I do anything at this point? A Q&A? All right. Who's going to run the Q? I'm going to run the Q&A? Okay. Okay, come help.
I know we have people on Zoom. If you're on Zoom and want to ask a question, type it into the chat, and we have one of our student assistants who are going to read out your question to us. So if you have a question in the room, raise your hand. If you're in Zoom, put it in the chat, and I will keep an eye out on our Zoom team over there.
You can also comment, complain, argue, challenge, whatever you like. Look, I've left you all flattened. Okay, brave person.
I'm quite interested in what you said with respect to agricultural subsidies. I wonder, because the subsidy framework right now is, well, it's there's been discussion, right, as to the subsidy scheme in this country prioritizing crops grown for export, such as soybeans and
Corn.
And corn, yes. And I was wondering whether you could discuss somewhat about the advocacy by groups such as Food Action, I think that's their name, for subsidy reform.
Yeah, first of all, I can explain, or the Department of Agriculture can explain the American food system in one slide. I didn't show it because it's off topic from this, but since you asked.
Sorry.
So that slide illustrates trends in the distribution of corn in the United States. And there are 12 billion bushels of corn produced every year in the United States. That's a lot of corn. Almost half of it goes for animal feed. Almost half of it goes for ethanol to fuel automobiles, leaving a tiny fraction, a minute fraction of the corn that's produced in America to feed people. We do not have a food system that's focused on feeding people. We have a food system that's focused on feed for animals and fuel for automobiles in the case of corn and diesel in the case of soybeans. It's the same for soybeans. What subsidies do is encourage farmers to grow as much of those crops as is possible, because the more of the crops they grow, the more money in subsidies they get, no matter where they grow those crops, no matter how much water those crops take up, and no matter how much pesticide, herbicide, and land destruction is done by growing those crops. That requires reform. We need a food system, I think. I mean, obviously you have to feed animals, but these are industrial systems. So we need a food system that's focused on food for people. Should we be growing half of our corn and soybeans for fuel? Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense to me. Yes, this is ripe for reform. Will we get it? Yes, if we can get money out of politics.
Hello, everyone.
Good.
Thank you so much, Professor. I had this question. I've heard two controversial opinions about alcohol in our diet. Some opinions or ideas emphasize that alcohol should be avoided, and that's healthy. And we also have some areas, like the blue zones, some of them, they drink wine every day, and that's what they believe is part of what makes them live healthier and longer. So how does that, which one of it is more scientifically proven or supported, and what's your stake on that?
Okay. The dietary guideline, I didn't talk about the alcohol guideline, but there was a big controversy about the alcohol guideline in the new dietary guidelines because all it does is say consume less alcohol without specifying less than what. Previous dietary guidelines said no more than 2 drinks a day, and these are defined drinks, for men and 1 for women because women don't metabolize alcohol as well as men do. And they took out those numbers and also did not talk about the very strong correlation between alcohol intake and risk of cancer, particularly breast cancer. They didn't say anything about youth drinking. And so there's a big controversy about that. And that had to do with 3 reports on alcohol intake and health that came out about a year ago. And those reports said different things. A report from the Surgeon General said that alcohol, any amount of alcohol, was linked to 7 different kinds of cancer. A report from the Department of Agriculture, commissioned report specifically for the dietary guidelines, also talked about cancer risk, but that report was suppressed. It was never allowed to be released. A third report was done by the National Academies of Sciences, and that report, which had several people involved in it who had links to the alcohol industry, said that drinking small amounts of alcohol reduced the risk for heart disease and that you really didn't need to worry about cancer risk. And it was that report that these current dietary guidelines used as the basis. It ignored the other ones. So I think from a scientific standpoint, less is better. The blue zones, which refers to areas of the world in which there are groups of people who live exceptionally long and healthy lives, wine is often, but not always, a part of their daily intake, but they're not doing binge drinking, and they're doing lots and lots and lots of other healthful practices at all. And as with any one food in the diet, it's very, very difficult to attribute a health benefit or risk to one food because it depends so much on everything else that people are doing. I would say the blue zone example means that if you're living like blue zone people, you can probably handle that much alcohol pretty well. If you're not living like blue zone people, you're probably better off with less, like anything else.
You were generous in giving your own trajectory, right? Starting in bacteriology, molecular biology, the bench work, you moved on. So and all of that, of course, was essential because it's hard enough to be taken seriously in a flood of information today, but I picture someone trying to start up a whole new field and be taken seriously without those degrees, and that's what makes it such a good story. And I wonder today, are there areas in nutrition and food science where you wish there were more scholars?
Oh, I'm a public health person. I think the big issues. It's interesting. There's been a real division in the nutrition field on research between nutrition, sort of pure nutrition science, and public health nutrition. Pure nutrition science, I'm going to go out on a limb here. It's answered most of the questions about nutrition. We know what's required in the diet. We know a lot about how much is required in the diet. And we have a really good idea about what a healthy diet is. And the dietary guidelines haven't changed in any fundamental way since 1980. I mean, they haven't changed because the research hasn't changed. You know, if you're eating largely whole foods and you're not eating a lot of processed junk foods, and you're eating a wide variety of foods, which is the secret of healthy nutrition, because foods have different amounts of nutrients and they complement each other. If you just don't eat too much of any one thing and eat a lot of different things, you'll be doing fine. Those problems are solved. And they're answered. I mean, there may be details about the answers, but the basic fundamentals are solved. And so where nutrition science is going now is into something called precision nutrition, which is to identify for each individual your particular genetic composition, and then to prescribe a specific diet that is going to exactly promote maximal health given your particular genetic makeup. This is the antithesis of public health. Dietary recommendations are public health recommendations. Everybody could follow those and do pretty well. Okay, if you're rich and have fabulous medical care and are willing to invest, precision nutrition is for you. The entire wellness industry is focused on precision nutrition. The idea is to get you to wear a glucose monitor, to get you to wear an Oura ring, to do these things so that all of your individual little things are measured and you can tell whether what you're eating for lunch is going to raise your blood sugar. Holy smoke. Whatever happened to the enjoyment of food? Food is one of life's greatest pleasures. I'm not a big fan of precision nutrition, and I think the wellness industry has very, very little evidence to back up the kinds of things that are being promoted. And for heaven's sakes, don't do protein supplements, really. They go way too far. I'm much more concerned about public health. The big questions facing humanity are that there are 1 billion people in the world who don't have enough to eat every day. How are we going to get food to them? How do we teach small farmers how to grow enough to feed their families and have enough of a surplus so that they can sell it and send their kids to school? That seems to be a major, major, major problem, well worth working on. 2 billion people in the world are overweight or obese and have metabolic problems that require a level of medical care that no country can afford to manage. How do we prevent people from developing overweight? How do we prevent people from having metabolic problems that require GLP-1 drugs or whatever? And those seem to me to be problems that are really worth working on. And that's where the research needs to be. So public health isn't very popular these days. And in talking to public health students recently, they're really concerned about where the jobs are going to be. I gave the graduation address at Hopkins School of Public Health, and every single one of those students was expecting to work for AID. AID doesn't exist anymore. Those students are being trained to do international work, and it doesn't exist. So it seems to me that's where the big problems are, is how do we set up a food environment that promotes health, not disease? When Kennedy says our current food environment promotes disease, he's right. He's absolutely right. How do we fix that? These are social problems. They're very, very difficult to research. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be researched. It means you got to figure out better ways of doing it. Anyway, that's where I am on that one. Um, there's one. Very quiet group. Have you been beaten into submission?
Hi,
And there's one over
Professor.
here, too.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think is the role of spontaneity and curiosity in the fight for food
The
justice?
role of what? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
I'm curious, what's the role of, like, what do you see as the role of spontaneity and curiosity in the fight for food justice?
I don't understand the question. Can you be more specific?
Yes, I can. Essentially, I'm curious to know if you think that things like being spontaneous or remaining creative are important in the fight for food justice.
What's the alternative to that?
I'm curious because I do think that in the current like kind of understanding the struggles of today and the fight for justice, I think there's a lot of focus on kind of what's the loudest strategy or what's the most aggressive or what's the most, like the greatest ways to make impact. And I'm curious, what are the roles of spontaneity and creativity in this?
Okay, I may not be answering this satisfactorily to you, but there is advocacy and advocacy. And it turns out that successful advocacy has been very, very well studied. There's a long research literature on how to do advocacy successfully. And if you're going to be an advocate, you want to do it in a way that has some likelihood of being successful. And there's a book. It's called Organizing for Social Change. And it's published by something called the Midwest Academy. It's a paper-bound book. You can buy it on Amazon or wherever. And if you want to do advocacy, I would recommend reading that book because it gives a step-by-step analysis of every single thing you have to do in order to mount a campaign that has a good possibility of success. And the elements in that, you have to identify with enormous precision what your goal is. And let me tell you, that's not easy. You know, you want to have food justice. Okay, what do you mean by that? What specifically do you mean? What needs to change? What do you want to see at the end of it? Very, very difficult to do that. Not as easy as it sounds. Once you've identified that goal, you have to have allies who want that goal. And those allies come together to develop a plan for meeting that goal. Who has the possibility for helping you achieve that goal? And that is the target, that person or that institution is the target of your campaign. You develop a campaign. Then you have to have lots of help. You have to have lots of people who believe in your campaign and are willing to help with it. That's where community organizing comes in. And then you organize the campaign, do it, and if it doesn't work, you analyze it. And I can't tell you how few advocacy campaigns pay attention to what I would consider the rules of successful advocacy. Almost nobody pays any attention to them, and then they don't understand why the campaigns didn't work. I use in my book, Soda Politics, the Berkeley soda tax as an example of a campaign that was run by experienced community organizers who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how to go about defeating soda industry millions of dollars in trying to defeat what they were doing and to achieve a soda tax in Berkeley. They did a brilliant job of it. And it involved going door to door to every single neighborhood in Berkeley, which has rich people and poor people. It went to every single neighborhood And they got that soda tax with a vote of 76%. 76% of the voters voted for that tax. That's astonishing. That's a success. And they still have it, and they've used the money for social purposes as they promised. So when you say spontaneity, I want to know spontaneity on imposed on what, or as part of what? Because if the campaign isn't organized in a way that has a clear focus, a clear target, a clear campaign, and lots and lots and lots of help, it's not going to succeed. So I'm, organizing for social change, really worth reading. So I hope that answers it.
So this is a pretty New York question, I suppose, especially West Village. Given like the semi-recent legalization of cannabis, what is?
Can you move the microphone? Yeah, thanks.
Given the semi-recent legalization of cannabis, I was wondering what current scholarly attitudes towards its nutritional content are.
I didn't understand. Can you repeat it again, and can you shout?
Got it. So considering the semi-recent legalization of cannabis, I was wondering what current...
Cannabis. I missed that word. That was the word I missed, the critical word. I have a chapter in my book, What to Eat Now, about cannabis edibles. And what's your concern about them?
About what current scholarly attitudes are towards their
Scholarly
nutritional...
attitudes to cannabis. I don't track the literature very closely, but the literature that I see is all about pediatric patients, kids getting into their parents' edibles. I'm only interested in edibles. I don't smoke. I'm only interested in edibles. And there's an enormous concern that because so many edibles are copycat products that look like candy or snack foods, that kids get into them. And pediatric emergency rooms are filled with kids who have gotten into their parents' edibles and are having a very hard time with it. So, and then I'm also seeing lots and lots of stuff about excessive cannabis intake not being very healthy for you, not doing what it's supposed to do, not doing, not solving mental health problems, not doing whatever. That's what I'm seeing. But as I said, I'm not following it very closely. Is that what you have in mind? There's plenty of it out there in the medical literature. I tend to look at the medical literature. Oh, and I should say, I was thinking of showing a slide of what I read on a daily basis, and I decided not to because it's a little overwhelming. But I get probably 20 or 30 newsletters that I review every day, and I read the medical literature, the nutrition literature, the food studies literature, I read a lot. Fortunately, I'm a fast reader. I don't always retain it as well as I should, but I read a lot. And if you need help finding the cannabis literature, I can tell you where to find it. But the only place that I see it is in medical journals, and they're not happy with it. No. And also, because it's of the regulation, you don't really know what you're getting, especially in the edibles. And I should say, just my own history, you'll love this. I never touched the stuff because when I was much, much younger, I had a brownie and nothing happened, and then I had another one. It was a classic. Right. 3 days later, it was a bad trip. Anyway, on that happy note.